Hi. Labyrinth from Moog is a synth, but even more than that, it's a melodic idea machine that can compose on its own with some guidance from you. It has dual generative sequencers, meaning you can't actually program specific notes into them. Rather, they create and audition melodies and rhythms for you within scales and note ranges you determine. On the synthesis side, it has 2 oscillators and a filter, with Moog venturing further into West Coast and metallic territory with Through Zero FM and a wave folder. Moog has combined all these ideas into a single, semi-modular package that functions as its own physical instrument. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at how it works and sounds, what exactly generative sequencing means, and discuss a few pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Moog sent me Labyrinth. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. Labyrinth is a semi-modular synth in the same size and form factor as Moog's 4 others. You don't need to patch anything to use it, but its 32-point patch bay opens up alternative routings as well as the ability to connect to other modular synths. Broadly speaking, the top 2/3 of the panel are synthesis controls, and the bottom third lets you control its 2 generative sequencers. On the sequencer side, it has 2 sequencers with up to 8 steps, or bits as they're called here, and they can be chained together into a single sequence of up to 16 steps. The thing is that unlike other sequencers, you can't actually set specific note values for each step. Rather, these get assigned randomly by Labyrinth. Now, if you think a random stream of notes can't be the basis of a musical result, I have some videos of cats walking on a piano to show you. But like those cat videos, Labyrinth uses a few tricks to make things more musical. First, the note values can be quantized to a scale or a chord. So these are just totally random values, and these are those same values quantized to a scale. Kind of like the cat only walking on white or black keys. And more importantly, what those cat videos don't show you, and why they may be a bit corrupt if you don't mind the pun, is all the takes they edited out that didn't sound so good. And that's kind of how the corrupt knob works. This is the basic pattern that was previously generated but is now stable. As I turn the corrupt knob clockwise, note values will be changed, but the step status or bit status on or off won't change. And if I hear a pattern that I like, I can stop corrupting it. But if you don't like what you're hearing, just throw the cat on the piano again. The farther you turn corrupt clockwise, the more likely it is the sequence will change. And beyond noon, bits or steps will start turning on and off. To stop the madness, turn corrupt all the way back counterclockwise. This works in a very similar way to the Turing machine by Music Thing Modular, if you're familiar with it. It can take a while, and it may not come up with something you like, but ultimately you might find something you like. There are a few other slightly less chaotic ways to come up with ideas here, and other additional musical tricks I'll discuss in a bit, but meanwhile let's continue with the overview. On the synth side, Labyrinth has 2 oscillators. Their range is printed on the panel, and as the label implies, the mod VCO can also be used as an LFO, a low-frequency oscillator. Unlike typical Moog synths, these oscillators aren't harmonically rich, just a simple sine and triangle wave. The idea is that you add harmonic complexity, either with a wave folder, using FM, or the ring mod. Once you've added harmonics, and you can throw in some noise, you can then apply filtering. The filter and wave folder can be routed into each other in series or played in parallel to each other, with the blend control crossfading the outputs of the two. The synth also has 2 decay envelopes here in the corner, one routed by default to the overall level or VCAs of the 2 parallel paths, and another envelope hooked up to various destinations on the panel. Then there's the patch bay, which lets you break these default connections or make new ones, as well as unlocks features that you can't access on the panel, like separate clocking for the 2 sequencers and separate access to each of the 2 VCAs of the filter and wave folder signal chains. The patch bay also has a TRS type A MIDI input, which you can use for clock sync to play Labyrinth just like a regular synth, or if you've had too much randomness to sequence or arpeggiate it with a regular arpeggiator, and you can also transpose its sequences with external MIDI. And then clock sync works very nicely as far as I could tell. Labyrinth is a pretty fun way to avoid repetitive melodic patterns. Labyrinth has a single mono audio output in the back, and it can be taken out of its enclosure and mounted in a Eurorack case. It comes with a power supply, a few patch cables, this cheat sheet, and a quick start pamphlet in the box. The full manual is available as a download. Okay, let's dive right into the dual sequencers and see how they work. Each has up to 8 steps, or bits as they're called here, and you can determine their length using the length button. So I can shorten the sequence to 5 steps or fewer, or even 1, or 8. If a step LED or bit is on, it means that step will trigger a note. And if it's off, it means a note isn't triggered. When a note is triggered, the value stored in that step will be sent out the sequencer to whatever is willing to accept it on the panel or in the patch bay. While the natural inclination is to think of the sequencer as just sequencing pitch, you can use it to sequence timbres. I'll disconnect it from pitch just so we can hear it a bit better. Say different timbres. Notice how the timbre changes on some of the notes based on the value stored in each step. The thing is, you don't have control over the value stored in each step or bit. Labyrinth determines that on its own randomly every time it or you activate a bit. Let's bring pitch control back up, clear both sequences, maybe set a length of 4 steps and check out how this works. So initially, a pattern is empty. I could flip a bit manually just by hitting this button and flip a different bit. So now I've turned these 2 on, so I have some degree of control, but obviously not on the pitches. I could flip a bit off and turn it back on, but now the pitch is totally different. So you don't have control over the value of the steps, but you do have some control over whether they're on or off. If you don't like a note, you can flip it off, it doesn't get offended, and then re-flip it on again, in which case the bit will get a new random value. This semi-manual way of sequencing is one way of sequencing Labyrinth. Like I mentioned earlier, you can have everything done for you using Corrupt. Turning Corrupt up to 12 o'clock will gradually increase the chance that the value of an active bit will change as the playhead passes over it, up to 25% or 1 in 4 passes. Beyond noon, Corrupt starts to flip bits, and the probability of the value in a step changing also increases, up to 50%. All the way clockwise, there is 50% chance that a bit will flip, and a 50% chance that its value will change. So let's say that after multiple attempts, I've landed on a pattern that I like. Notice, by the way, that it starts on this bit. I can shift the bits until it starts on step 1 if I want. That's important for sync, say with external clock. And then moving on from Corrupt, Labyrinth gives you a few interesting ways to control your melodies so things aren't totally random. By default, bit values are anywhere between -5 and +5 volts, meaning a potential 10-octave range. Since you may want melodies that don't quite span that range, the CV range parameter lets you attenuate or compress the voltage range down so that melodies span fewer octaves, all the way down to a single note. But as you expand or decompress the voltage range, the same core rhythm and feel of the melody is maintained, but the melodic intervals start to expand. And I think this is a really interesting and unique performance control. Unlike corrupt, by the way, this isn't destructive. So you can always expand the note range and then compress it back down, and the melody stays the same. Now, if you want to venture on here into a bit of corruption and are worried your pattern might go in a direction you don't like, you can always hold this button to save these two patterns into a pattern slot, and then go ahead and corrupt the pattern. Either corrupt the pitches or corrupt it totally by flipping bits on and off. And if we don't like where we arrived, just hit buffer and we're back at our original pattern. There is only one storage slot though. Another important way Labyrinth gives you a degree of control over the random melodies it generates is its 15 built-in scales. So rather than send out totally random voltages, you can snap voltages stored in a sequence to any one of these options. Swapping quantization of scales is somewhat labeled on the panel. You hold bit shift and then press either bit flip or length to move back and forth between the 15 available scale slots. So the first slot is totally unquantized, but moving to the right starts quantizing to one of the various scales. For quantization to work properly, you need to make sure to turn up the mod depth of the sequencer to oscillator pitch all the way to Qtz. Otherwise, things might sound interesting, but definitely not quantized to your scale. And you tune the oscillator to the root note of the scale. More on this and modes in the patch tips section. A bit more about the sequencers, and just for fun, let's put them on the voltage scope here. So these can control, say, the pitch of the oscillators. This is oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, controlled by sequencer 2. You can see its values here. And we can chain the sequences, in which case both sequencers will output the same value in parallel as they play through the sequence. However, if we hit bit shift, it will shift the playhead forward for sequence 2, and that will apply to whatever sequence 2 is connected to, for example, this output and this oscillator. And that's why we have this scope. You can see how one sequence is slightly shifted compared to the other. We can also shift them back with a shortcut that's bit shift plus reset. So I can align them back if I want, or shift them against each other again. For all kinds of, I think, very interesting melodic exploration. So if I shift them back together, both oscillators will play in unison. But if I start to offset sequencer 2, interesting melodies and two-note chords may ensue. You can also see the two separate playheads running along here as you increasingly shift one playhead from the other. The advance is an interesting feature. It not only advances step by step through your sequence, let's go back to two sequences, but also if you've got corrupt up, it will totally change both sequences. You can see bits being flipped and values being changed. And in a somewhat obscure feature, you can also separate the right head from the playhead on a per sequence basis. So right now you can see just one single dot advancing and corrupting the sequence, but if you hit bit shift and advance, then now the playhead and the right head are separated. And I think we covered all the important shift combos. You can reset a pattern's length by holding length and pressing reset. Okay, so those were the sequencers. Let's take a listen to the synth engine on Labyrinth. And for that, I'm going to invoke drone mode, which is basically this. Let's start by listening to the oscillators. We've got a sine wave oscillator. This is its frequency range, and a triangle, which goes into low inaudible mod rates. And you may have noticed I increased levels only just a smidge, because once you go beyond 11 o'clock on mixer levels, it starts to soft clip the signal, and we no longer have a sine wave, but rather something more saturated. Now, these non-harmonically rich oscillator options are certainly a departure from Moog, not a triangle, but certainly a sine wave. There's not much to filter here. Maybe if we push it into the mixer, but still, not a lot. And that's where other wave shaping options come in. For example, the through 0 FM. So this is oscillator 2, the mod VCO, modulating the pitch of oscillator 1, or the main VCO. And at audio rates, this generates pleasing FM-style sounds. Through 0 FM helps the main oscillator stay in pitch as you increase mod depth. Then the next cross-mod option is ring mod. Again, the oscillators impact each other to generate interesting tones based on their relative frequencies. The oscillators are joined in the mixer by a noise generator. Sounds really nice. With tone controls, pre-filter, and like I mentioned, the mixer is very much prone to distortion, both for a single oscillator as well as two. So when we start bringing in additional sources, even at relatively low levels, not to mention higher ones, very interesting sounds start to emerge as the oscillators push each other into the headroom limits of the mixer. You get sounds which sort of sound like ring mod, but it's not ring mod. It's more like audio rate amplitude modulation, as the oscillators' frequencies are added to each other or cancel each other out because they push into the mixer so hard. And we still haven't filtered or folded anything. So that's the mixer. Let's move on and talk about the wave folder. Wave folders love curvy shapes, like sines and triangles. Wave folding is a form of distortion that when audio hits a limit, instead of clipping, like it does in the mixer, the wave starts to fold onto itself. Both add harmonics, but sound very different, as you can hear. And the wave folder also has a bias control, so by default, a wave folder folds the top and bottom of the waveform evenly. Bias allows you to apply an offset to the waveform so that the fold doesn't get applied evenly to the top half or the bottom half of the wave shape. This changes the character of the sound, of course, as the waveform gets folded asymmetrically. Let's move on and take a listen to the filter. It's a 12 dB per octave filter that morphs from low pass to band pass with resonance, of course. Resonance doesn't reduce bass, but it also doesn't self-oscillate. And of course, you can filter not a sine wave, but either a distorted one or a frequency modulated one. Or you could filter the harmonically rich audio coming out of the wave folder, which is a good opportunity as any to talk about routing. The simplest routing is in parallel. You've got two parallel signal chains, and you control the blend between the two using this knob. So I could listen to just the wave folder, or just the filter. And so we cut down resonance a bit, or both. So this is our folder, and this is our filtered sound. And you can blend between the two. Blend always controls the balance between the output of the folder and the output of the filter, but this switch determines how they're routed into each other and where the mixer goes. So when I point it up, the mixer output gets sent into the wave folder first, and then into the filter. To hear just the filter, we'll put this in VCF mode. So this is our wave folded sound, and we can totally filter it if we want. With resonance, of course. So audio is routed like this from the mixer, and I can always go back to just the wave folded sound by turning blend back to the output of the folder. And then the other series routing is filter into folder. So now the mixer gets routed into the filter, and then that goes into the folder. Let's listen just to the folder output. So I can now first filter my sound. Let's take something harmonically rich. So I can filter that, and then send that into the folder. And again, despite the series routing, if I wanted, I could also pick up the output of the filter on its own, or blend between the two. So that's the core of the signal path in terms of modulation. You've got two envelopes. These are both decay envelopes. Envelope 2 is routed by default both to the filter and to the folder's VCAs. This is as long as it goes. And it can go shorter, of course. And envelope 1 has bipolar mod depth controls across the panel. So you can use it for pitch, to create percussive sounds, or for the wave folder. Goes both ways, by the way, bipolar. Or, of course, to the filter as well. One super important thing about the envelopes, you can use the trig mix knob to set them to be triggered either by sequence 1 or by sequence 2 at the extremes, or to gradually reduce the velocity of one as you approach the other. This can lead to very interesting rhythmic effects, especially, say, when the sequences are set to different lengths. I think this is a great composition and performance tool. Okay, so those are the basics of Labyrinth. Let's take a look at a few patch ideas and tips to make the most of it. The first is duophony. So you've got two sequencers, but by default, these trigger the envelopes at the same time. One goes to the VCA and another for various timbre controls. What we want is to have one sequencer trigger, say, envelope 1 and another to trigger envelope 2, and have each of those routed to each of the two VCAs. Luckily, that's something we can fix by separating the VCA articulation of the folder path from that of the filter path, because they actually have two VCAs that we can control from the patch bay. The first thing we'll want to change is the trig mix, move it to sequence 1. It still triggers both envelopes right now, but we're going to separate the sequencing of the envelopes so that sequencer 1 still triggers envelope 1, but sequencer 2 will trigger envelope 2. And we'll also separate the triggering of the VCAs. Let's take envelope 1 and have that trigger the folder VCA, this path. Envelope 2 controls this by default, so we don't need to patch it. And then we need to bypass the mixer for either the folder or the filter. Let's say take the noise generator and connect that into the VCF input, into the filter input. And then we need to reduce the level of noise going into the folder's signal path. And that's pretty much it. We can now control the balance between our two paths using the blend knob. So this is our filtered noise. And this is everything else going into the mixer. And you can notice each has their own articulation, own decay articulation. I could say, turn this into a more percussive kick, maybe. Let's shorten the length. And deflip some bits. And I'm going to fast forward to save you some time spent tinkering. So after messing around with it for a bit, we get this. We've got separate control over the envelopes. And if we wanted, we could also do the same thing to the second VCO, to the mod VCO, and filter that separately from VCO1, our kick in this case. And fast forward a bit more, we could tune the oscillators to each other and just play entirely different melodies. One oscillator going through the filter, another through the folder. You can mix the two together. Each gets their own VCA envelope for double the melodic exploration fun. Okay, let's move on to the next tip. If you've had your fill of all these West Coast sounds and you want to go back to the East Coast, Labyrinth doesn't have a square wave, a harmonically rich square wave sound. You can push the sine wave into the mixer and get a sort of square. However, if we wavefold that, it starts looking and sounding more and more like a square wave. We could then feed the folder into the filter out some of those more rough edges, and we're comfortably back on the East Coast. Well, that's nice, I hear you say, but what about pulse waves? Well, that's where the VCW bias comes in. The asymmetric wavefolding gives us effectively control over the pulse width. So I hear you ask, we've got pulse width control, what about pulse width modulation? Well, there's no voltage input to control bias. We can do it manually, but that's no fun. However, we can create a similar offset using the mod VCO by moving it into LFO rates, and then gradually pushing it into the mixer. We get an effect that's very similar to modulating bias, which sounds like a slightly nasal or comb-filtered PWM, but especially when filtered, I think is pretty convincing. Giving us nice East Coast timbres to push into the filter. Let's ask Labyrinth for a sequence. So, pretty cool, I think. Next up, just a quick folding tip. There's a difference between a clipped sine wave that gets folded and a non-clipped one. Just in terms of the timbres, I think the non-clipped version sounds better, but certainly different is nice too. Next quick tip to tune the oscillators to each other, bring the sequence amount down on both and levels to where they don't modulate each other. You can tune them to each other, or a fifth above, or an octave above, which helps with FM. Next tip, if you look at the scales, you'll see some pretty basic ones are missing. There's major and melodic minor and harmonic minor, but these aren't like regular minor, nor are there any of the other basic musical modes like Lydian, Dorian, Phrygian, which some of us might enjoy dabbling in. There's also major pentatonic, but allegedly no minor pentatonic. Now, the reason that I said seemingly and allegedly is because as far as I know, voltages assigned to steps are indeed totally random, so there's no emphasis on a particular root note or any note. As long as you don't turn the range all the way down to the same note, as you expand the range, you're equally likely to hear any note in the scale regardless of the root. So indeed, these scale options are scales and not modes. There's nothing in the way the randomizer works to anchor you in the Aeolian mode of any major scale as opposed to, say, Dorian or Phrygian. So if we've activated the major scale, which is number 3 here, we've really activated major, minor, Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian all at the same time. It's up to us to anchor the mode using a static note or notes in the second sequencer or an external sequencer. Long story short, if you've tuned the oscillators to C when the range is all the way down, you've tuned to C major, but also A minor, D Dorian, E Phrygian, and so on. If you wanted to tune to C minor, you'd need to tune the oscillators to E flat. So if a friend tells you, hey buddy, let's jam in C Phrygian, tell them no problem, quickly do the math or Google what's the relative major of C Phrygian, that's A flat, and tune Labyrinth to that. Next up, the mod VCO has a sync input to reset its phase. However, the main oscillator doesn't have an output on the patch bay, so theoretically you can't get the classic audio rate style sync sounds from the mod VCO. So one way of using this would be, say, to use a sequencer to reset the VCO's cycle, put it in a low rate, and then use it to modulate something, say, for example, the VCA, which gives us an attack decay envelope. We don't have attack, so that's good, but it loops because it's an LFO. However, each step will reset it, so at least we have consistency in the modulation on a per step basis. So that's one way of doing things, but what if we insisted we wanted oscillator sync-like sounds? We could cheat and use an external oscillator and patch that over here, but instead we'll patch the mod VCO, say, into the filter input, make sure we reduce its level in the mixer, because we're bypassing the mixer and going in directly into the filter, but we will use oscillator 1 from the mixer, and that kind of gives us the missing VCO output we needed for oscillator sync. Make sure to set the frequency of oscillator 1 to lower than that of the mod VCO, and you can hear oscillator sync style sounds. Now we'll want to modulate this, and luckily we have an envelope just for that. Let's take a listen. Maybe filter this a bit. So that's yet another way to extract interesting timbres from Labyrinth. Next up, the two sequences are an excellent opportunity for polymeters and polyrhythms. For polymeters, just change the sequence lengths to different lengths. So this is a 7-step sequence, and this is a 5-step one. And then for polyrhythmic sequences, you can either use an external clock or clock divider, or the mod VCO, say into clock 2, for other interesting rhythmic effects. So now you can see I'm controlling how fast sequence 2 moves with the mod VCO. You can slow it down or speed it up to insane rates. Could be an interesting thing to experiment with. Then final tip, if you want drone mode, patch a sequencer into one of the VCAs or both, and as long as there's a high voltage coming out of the sequencer, Labyrinth will drone on. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Labyrinth. And here we're in a situation that there's not much to compare this to in terms of a standalone instrument like you'd compare a monosynth or a drum machine to another one. It's its own thing, and there's nothing I know of like it. I guess the competition to this would be either a custom-built Eurorack system with 2 Turing machines, quantizers, oscillators, wavefolder, filter, envelopes, and VCAs, or a similar patch in software form in VCVRack. The hardware Eurorack competitor would be more expensive, but likely more expandable and customizable, and the software version would be much cheaper or free, but it wouldn't be a standalone instrument and wouldn't have the same hands-on playable controls and patching opportunities unless you started MIDI mapping a controller with enough knobs and buttons to match what's on the panel. So that aside, pros for Labyrinth I think are that there's something special to the hands-on experience here. The corrupt and CV range knobs shine, by the way, in terms of how they can be used for performance. It seems like they're a bit underrated by Moog if you look at their size, but I'd definitely consider getting bigger knob caps for them. The trig mix knob also I think is an excellent performance control. And then on the sound engine side, Labyrinth sounds totally different from any other Moog. Wavefolding through 0FM and ring mod give it a more metallic and aggressive character compared to the brassy tones of a filtered sawtooth. For better or worse, at times I found myself wanting to step back from these tones, hence the PWM patch I mentioned earlier. And then a general pro is the extensive patch bay, both for internal patching and for connecting to external Eurorack modules or other modular synths. The dual VCAs, separate clocking, and access to patching the sequence outputs to external gear makes this a very expandable and flexible module to add to a bigger setup. Then on the cons side, since there's nothing like it, you could say that there are none, but still, I found that it takes longer than I'd like to fine-tune the oscillators to a specific pitch, and while the generative aspects are the core of what makes this special, if you like to program your own melodies, this isn't for you. You need to be ready and willing to embrace what this comes up with, or to just continuously audition melodies until you find one you like. It would be great if they came up with a feature where you could advance to a specific step and then maybe hold the shift and set the CV range for it, just in case you also wanted a more traditional sequencing workflow, or if there's one annoying note in a sequence that you just have to change. And then a general caveat, you can't save patches here. There are no presets except the single sequence that you can store. So the lesson is to always be recording, because it may not be possible to get back to a particular sound you dialed in, not to mention a particular fleeting melody. So that's it for Labyrinth. Certainly a very outside the box synth and sequencer. If you like the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.